U.S. involvement and escalation. You see, the United States sent troops to fight in Vietnam. And unlike conventional wars, the enemy was not in a certain place. The goal was nation building, meaning that we had to not only conquer, but we had to equip the people to govern themselves. It's a very complicated task, and unfortunately, this quickly proved unwinnable. Now, let's talk about the beginning of the war. Johnson won re-election in 1964 on the promise of keeping America out of Vietnam. And he understood that he had made that promise to the American people. But yet his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, advised the President on escalation. His Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, advised the President on escalation. Robert McNamara, coming from the perspective of the fall of Vietnam to communists, represents a clear and present danger to United States military security. Basically, it's a preemptive action. We have to do this thing, or it's going to affect us. Dean Rusk, Secretary of State, responsible for foreign affairs, relations with other countries, is coming from the perspective of the domino theory, that if we are to stop the spread of communism, as the Truman Doctrine clearly stated is our purpose in foreign policy through the years of the Cold War, if we're going to actually stop the spread of communism, we have to fight these battles. Because if Vietnam falls, Laos and Cambodia and Indonesia, and who's next? And meanwhile, guess what? At the beginning of wars, people are all about it. Country music songs are made, parades, barbecues, picnics. People, everybody wants their picture in uniform, so people rush to enlist and sign up. I mean, if you don't believe me, start Googling, images of the first part of the war. People get excited about this for some weird reason. The majority of Congress was behind this because, like in the war with Mexico, even though we know that was fabricated, and also we know, by the way, that the Tonkin Gulf incident was somewhat fabricated, because we also know, and this wasn't published until 1975, that the president had the intention of escalating the war in Vietnam long before the Tonkin Gulf incident. But he got to go to Congress and say, American blood on American soil. So the majority of the people supported escalation. So General William Westmoreland was the U.S. commander in South Vietnam. And his perspective was that the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, that is the South Vietnamese Army, would be ineffective in stopping the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong from taking over South Vietnam and making South Vietnam a communist country. And so he requested an increasing number of soldiers. And so by 1967, there were 500,000 U.S. soldiers in Vietnam. So when Johnson made the decision to escalate the war in Vietnam, 500,000 U.S. soldiers. Now, to put that in perspective, this is nowhere near the scale of the Second World War. In the Second World War, we called for an army of 15 million to fight a two-front war. And we will send more before the war's over. But it's not to that scale. It's a limited engagement, but a very difficult mission. You see, the enemy is not just over that hill. They're not just in North Vietnam. In fact, they're the people. The Viet Cong were residents of South Vietnam who sympathized with Ho Chi Minh, who wanted to rid Vietnam of the United States presence. In fact, nation building was the mission. And it's proved very difficult. Just like nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan has proven very difficult. See, the Viet Cong don't have to wear uniforms. They can attack, they can run away, and they can blend into the populace. They can move among civilians. They can dig in even when the army would receive intelligence about the location of the enemy. They could dig deep enough to withstand airstrikes. And they could launch coordinated attacks from multiple locations because, once more, this is their home turf. And that's tough. Because, well, at least one presidential candidate recommended nuking the entire country, or at least carpet bombing large swaths of Vietnam. Why? Because, well, the Viet Cong could strike and then disappear. And how do you confront that? Well, the general tactic was to send men on patrol, to find the enemy. But yet these patrols were often disadvantaged from the very beginning. This is where improvised explosionary devices come into play. It's not hard to make a bomb that's going to cripple or kill a soldier. All you really have to do is cripple them, and then they get sent home. Well, that's simple. You can dig a punji trap. That is, you fall into it. Boom. You've your leg is now laced with E. coli. That costs nothing to build. You can make an explosionary device out of most anything, and that can maim a soldier. And so, yes, lots of U.S. soldiers were affected by booby traps and landmines. We did have clear tactical advantages in this war. We had the most advanced weapons on the planet. The most highly trained, sophisticated army on the planet. We had control of the skies from the very beginning. The Soviets were providing MiGs. Those are the advanced Soviet supersonic aircraft. And there were dogfights from time to time, between our F-14s and those Soviet MiGs. But those types of air battles were rare. Generally, we had control of the skies. And we obviously had more resources. We're talking about a tiny, poor country versus the United States, the world's leading superpower in the 1960s.
Hold on point.
It wasn't always fun. Lieutenant Dan was always getting these funny feelings about a rock or a trail or the road, so he'd tell us to get down, shut up.
Get down! Shut up!
So we did. I don't know much about anything, but I think some of America's best young men served in this war. There was Dallas from Phoenix. Cleveland, he was from Detroit.
Hey, Tex. Man, what the hell's going on?
And Tex was... Well, I don't remember where Tex come from.
Nothing. Whoop, platoon, on your feet. You've got 10 clicks to go to that river. Move out. Move. Get it out. Get it out back there.
The good thing about Vietnam is there was always some place to go.
Fire in the hole. Yeah, check out that hole.
And there was always something to do.
Travel up. Turn out. Cover your back.
One day, it started raining, and it didn't quit for 4 months. We've been through every kind of rain there is. A little bit of stinging rain, and big old fat rain. Rain that flew in sideways, and sometimes rain even seemed to come straight up from underneath.
So, there's a word I want to talk about with you guys, and that word is attrition. And that means to defeat the enemy when the enemy is everywhere requires a strategy that sounds very cold. It's simply to kill the enemy combatants until there aren't any more of them. Now, this war was not about claiming land, seizing territory, liberating cities. It was about killing the enemy until there weren't any left. But the trouble with the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh is they were willing to continue fighting. And our tactics and policies were radicalizing more of the Vietnamese people. Through going on these patrols, by dropping bombs in jungled areas or even sometimes in villages, we were actually helping to recruit the Vietnamese. Because the longer we were in country, the growing number of people in that country began to see us as the enemy. Not to mention, the Viet Cong continued to receive supplies from China and from the Soviet Union. And so it wasn't a matter of depriving them of resources, because we could never completely take and hold North Vietnam. And so it was easy, since North Vietnam borders China, to funnel supplies through China along the Ho Chi Minh Trail to continue to equip the Viet Cong. There's also a trouble of motivation. The United States saw this as a military and political struggle. We have to go to this place on the other side of the world, and we have to stop this enemy. Congratulations, you've been drafted. What? Couldn't even find this place on a map. What do I care about this place? Congratulations, you've been drafted. That's a growing proportion of the population of soldiers. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong saw this as a struggle for survival. This war is in their home. So attrition was the name of the game. But now try to do that at the same time as winning hearts and minds. And so these soldiers again get missions like handing out candy or goodwill missions. But yet, the weapons we were using in this war were hamstringing our ability to win hearts and minds. In the last clip, you just saw the use of napalm. Napalm is liquid fire. And you can drop it from a bomber, and you can instantly set an entire area on fire. It sticks to whatever it touches, even human skin. Well, okay, so the last clip you just saw a U.S. patrol completely annihilated because of an ambush in a deeply forested area. And so Agent Orange was developed. Agent Orange is an extremely effective herbicide. It will kill quickly anything that it touches. Anything that it touches. Drop it over an area, wait a week or so, all the trees have fallen. Go in, and then it's easy to find the enemy. Find them, blow up the hole, go in, destroy the entire complex. Well, Agent Orange is also an extremely toxic chemical. You know, my dad's best friend died from long-term exposure to Agent Orange. It took over 20 years to kill him. But yes, more and more soldiers were becoming affected by this. It affected the civilian populations who had to live there. And then finally, how do you defeat an enemy you can't see? Well, the general tactic was to send out soldiers on patrol. These are called skirmish missions. Walk around till someone starts shooting at you, and then you start shooting back. That's a U.S. patrol. That's a search and destroy mission. Find the enemy and then kill them. And again, how do you deal with an internal rebellion? We've seen this over and over in this class. The classic case is you go into the populace, you arrest the suspects, you isolate them from the rest of the population. By 1967, this war had created over 3 million refugees.
While the men on the ground desperately attempt to keep the North Vietnamese from overrunning the LZ, the pilots of the 1st Cavalry continue to ferry in the remainder of the 450 men amid a vicious torrent of enemy bullets and rockets.
There are things about battle that movies cannot teach you, and that is the true, horrendous noise of battle. Bullets cracking, bombs landing, artillery shells exploding, people screaming. It's just a cacophony that's almost deafening.
After nearly 8 hours of battle, casualties are mounting and supplies are running low. But with night fast approaching, all further landings must be called off until dawn. The 450 battered Americans are on their own and will have to survive the night in the face of an overwhelming enemy. A few hundred yards in front of them stands only a thin line of Americans, pounded and exhausted from nearly 24 hours of constant fighting. The enemy's sporadic attacks during the night were to determine the most vulnerable points in the U.S. lines. Now they know the best way to breach them, and they are preparing to put this knowledge to use.
At 6:50 a.m., 200 NVA soldiers hit C Company's 1st and 2nd platoons.
Lieutenant Charlie Hastings. Moore looks at him and says, "Call Broken Arrow." Broken Arrow was a code at that time, meant that an American unit was in dire danger of being overrun and wiped out. And when that call was given, every available fighter bomber in Vietnam diverted to that place to deliver their bombs. It was about then that I heard Colonel Moore yelling, "Get him off of us, Charlie. Get him off of us. Call that SOB off." And I looked up, and there are 2 F-100 Super Sabre jets like this. They're coming directly at us. Lead plane has already punched the pickle switch and will turn loose canisters of napalm. Hal was trying to stop the second guy from dumping his on us. But unfortunately for 2 or 3 engineer demolition guys, they were right in the path. And in that flame, I could see these 2 men dancing and screaming. And someone yelled, "Get this man's feet." And I reached down and picked him up, and his boots crumbled. The flesh on his ankles just peeled off. I could feel the ankle bone in the palm of my hands. And we carried him over to where the wounded were. It was a young specialist named Jim Nakayama out of Rigby, Idaho. Married. Wife had a baby that week. He died 2 days later. That boy is my nightmare. What I was learning was that there are some events that are so overwhelming that you can't simply be a witness. You can't be above it. You can't be neutral. You can't be untouched by it. Simple as that. You see it, you live it, you experience it, and it will be with you all of your days.
So it's one thing for me to tell you about it, but again, you have to hear it from the people who were there. I can tell you about napalm and Agent Orange, but hearing it from an eyewitness is, well, it's disturbing. So this type of warfare that the United States Army was dealing with is called guerrilla warfare. It's a French term meaning to subvert. So the Vietnamese knew they were confronting a superior force, so going head-to-head is not going to work in this situation. And attempting to destroy the enemy's morale is not working. We lost 58,000 American lives in this war. They lost over 1 million people. And they were going to continue fighting as long as it took. And soldiers who had been there for quite some time and seen this and been affected by it often turned to alcohol and to drugs, and some even committed heinous crimes and acts themselves. There were even cases of soldiers killing their officers when confronted with the reality of having to go back into these situations. The South Vietnamese government was extremely corrupt. The Army of the Republic of South Vietnam was completely incapable of dealing with this on their own. Most U.S. soldiers, however, continued to believe in their duty of serving their country, and also even believed in the justice of halting communism. And I think it's worth mentioning that the bravery and the courage exhibited by our veterans in the Vietnam War is admirable. And please take the time to listen respectfully when you get a chance to talk with folks who have served in these situations. If nothing else, show your appreciation for them. It's a simple thing to say thank you for your service, but at least it shows something. And most veterans don't prefer to talk about these experiences, but again, just be grateful for what they've done. Because having to deal with these things are things that I hope you never have to live through. Living in an environment where you could be hurt or killed is something that changes you. And back on the home front, one of the large-scale effects of this is that the war itself was obviously very expensive. And that results in a rise in inflation, that is, an increased cost of products, an increase in taxes, and absolutely it results in a decrease in funds for social programs. The war on poverty is going to be put on hold. But also for folks at home, we have televisions now. We have color televisions. We also have war correspondents, that is, journalists who are on the front lines. Some of the clips I've shown you have color footage of these actual battles, because those are shown not just on movie reels, but on home televisions. And what people are seeing every day is interviews of soldiers of how frustrating these experiences are. Ships coming home with coffins. And many began to claim there was a credibility gap, that maybe the government was not being entirely honest with us. Because, while the general was saying, the president is saying, we're winning this war, it's a matter of time before we finish this up. We have complete dominance of the country, we're just dealing with the last few pockets of rebellion. But what we're seeing on the television is more ships full of coffins. More interviews with soldiers talking about how this war is unwinnable. Who do we believe? All right, so let's work on our groups.